On Friday morning, it didn't have a name. By 2 o'clock on Monday morning, it was carrying sustained winds of 160 miles an hour, and it had become the strongest storm anywhere on Earth this year. Its name is Genevieve. It is spinning in open water several hundred miles southwest of the tip of Baja California, and it has not touched land. It is not going to touch land. Every forecast model agrees on that. And yet, right now, lifeguards from San Diego up through Ventura are watching a calendar. There is a day circled on it. Thursday. Here is what I want you to hold on to for the next few minutes, because it's the part of this story that almost nobody explains properly. A hurricane does not need to reach you to reach you. 12 years ago, a storm that stayed more than 1,000 miles offshore, that never made landfall in any country, managed to break through a stone barrier protecting one of the largest ports in the United States. I'll show you exactly how that happened and what it tells us about Thursday. But not yet. If you want the real numbers on this one, without the panic and without the invented drama, subscribe. Everything you're about to hear comes from the National Hurricane Center, the National Weather Service, and published measurements. Where the science is uncertain, I'll tell you it's uncertain. That's the whole deal here. So let's start with what actually happened over the weekend, because the speed of it is the story. On Friday, the 24th of July, forecasters at the National Hurricane Center in Miami were tracking a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms well southwest of Mexico. It got a name that day, Genevieve. At that point, it was a tropical storm, which is the meteorological equivalent of a rumor. Plenty of them never become anything. By Saturday evening, it had winds of about 80 miles an hour. That's a Category 1 hurricane, the mildest rung on the ladder. Strong enough to peel shingles off a roof and knock down a tree that was already leaning. Then, something took hold of it. By early Sunday, Genevieve was a Category 3 with winds near 120 miles an hour. By Sunday night into Monday morning, the National Hurricane Center measured maximum sustained winds of 160 miles an hour, Category 5, the top of the scale. There is no Category 6. That's the end of the chart. Put those two numbers side by side and let them sit there. 80 miles an hour Saturday evening, 160 miles an hour by 2 in the morning on Monday. The wind speed doubled in about 30 hours. But wind speed is a misleading way to think about it, because the destructive energy in a moving fluid doesn't scale with speed. It scales with the cube of speed. Double the wind, and you don't get twice the force. You get roughly 8 times it. Over one weekend, while most of the United States was doing ordinary weekend things, that storm went from being able to knock over a fence to being able to erase a town. The pressure at the center dropped to 929 millibars. If that number means nothing to you, here's the translation. Standard sea level pressure is around 1,013 millibars. Every millibar you drop is atmosphere being lifted off the ocean surface and thrown outward. At 929, the ocean underneath the eye is being physically pulled upward. The sea surface domes. If a storm like that ever crossed a coastline, that dome is what arrives first, and it's the part that kills people. Genevieve was, at that moment, about 520 miles south-southwest of the southern tip of the Baja California Peninsula, drifting northwest at 13 miles an hour. Hurricane force winds extended about 45 miles out from the center. Tropical storm force winds extended about 150 miles, which means the storm, edge to edge in its dangerous zone, was roughly 300 miles across. Wider than the drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, it has since eased back to Category 4. That's not the storm dying. That's a specific mechanical process, and it has a name, and I'll come back to it because it matters for what arrives on the California coast later this week. Now, why did this happen so fast? Storms like Genevieve are heat engines. They are, in the most literal sense, machines for moving warmth out of the ocean and into the upper atmosphere. Warm seawater evaporates, rises, condenses into cloud, and releases that stored energy as heat high above the surface. That heat makes the air rise faster, which pulls in more air at the bottom, which sucks up more moisture, which releases more heat. It is a loop that feeds itself. The only things that stop it are cold water underneath and shearing winds up top that tear the chimney apart. This weekend, neither one was in the way. The sea surface underneath Genevieve was running near 30 degrees Celsius. That's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Bath water. Hurricanes need water of about 80 degrees Fahrenheit to survive at all, so the ocean there wasn't just adequate, it was 6 degrees past the requirement. The wind shear was light to moderate, meaning the storm could stack its clouds vertically without being torn sideways. And the atmosphere around it held relative humidity above 80%, so no dry air got dragged into the core to choke it. But the surface temperature is the part everyone quotes and the part that explains the least. Here's what actually mattered. A hurricane sitting over the ocean churns it. The winds mix the water column, dragging cooler water up from below. Normally, that's the storm's own brake pedal. It stirs up its own cold water and starves itself. The only way a storm avoids that is if the warm layer goes down deep, so that when it mixes, it just brings up more warm water. The waters underneath Genevieve are warm, well below the surface. That is the difference between a storm that stalls at Category 2 and one that runs the table to Category 5 in a weekend. And the reason that deep warm layer exists this July has a name that most Americans have heard for decades without ever being told what it is: El Nino. Let me pause here, because the word gets used so loosely on television that it's basically lost its meaning. El Niño is not a storm. It's not a weather event. It's a redistribution of heat in the largest body of water on this planet. Normally, trade winds along the equator push warm surface water west toward Indonesia and Australia, and cold water wells up along the coast of South America to replace it. During El Niño, those winds slacken. The warm water that was piled up in the western Pacific sloshes back east. And when that happens, a slab of ocean roughly the size of the continental United States changes temperature. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration declared El Niño conditions on the 11th of June this year. By the middle of July, the Central Pacific Index used to measure it had climbed past 2 degrees Celsius above normal. On the 9th of July, forecasters put the odds of a very strong El Niño during October through December at 81%. That would rank it among the largest events in a record going back to 1950. And beneath the surface, between about 50 and 150 meters down, temperatures across a wide stretch of the equatorial Pacific are running as much as 6 degrees Celsius above average. 6 degrees, 100 meters down, across thousands of miles of ocean. That is a reservoir of stored energy that has no equivalent anywhere on the land surface of this planet, and it is directly upstream of where Genevieve formed. On the 21st of June this year, 2 independent European climate monitoring services, working separately with different methods, both concluded that daily global sea surface temperatures outside the polar regions had reached their highest levels ever recorded for that time of year. They agreed with each other. That's the part that gives the finding weight. 2 different approaches, same answer. So when you ask why a July storm went from a rumor to the strongest hurricane on Earth in about 30 hours, the honest answer is that it formed on top of an ocean carrying more heat than we have ever measured at this point in the year, at the start of what may become one of the strongest El Niño events in the modern record. Now here's the thing about that 30-hour transformation. It has a technical name, and there's a whole body of research behind it that has been making forecasters uneasy for about a decade. The National Hurricane Center defines rapid intensification as an increase in a storm's maximum sustained winds of at least 35 miles an hour within 24 hours. That's the threshold. Genevieve didn't just clear it, it roughly doubled it. Rapid intensification is not rare. About 80% of all major hurricanes go through it at some point in their lives. Among Category 4 and Category 5 storms, that figure rises to about 96%, which tells you something important. Storms don't usually grind their way to the top of the scale. They lunge. What has changed is how often the lunge happens. A study published in 2023 in the journal Scientific Reports found that tropical cyclones in the Atlantic were around 29% more likely to undergo rapid intensification in the years 2001 through 2020 than in the years 1971 through 1990. That's not a projection about the future. That's a comparison of two windows of the observed past. And the researcher Kiran Bhatia, who has spent years analyzing global trends in this behavior, found in a 2024 study that hurricanes which rapidly intensify shortly before landfall cause significantly higher damages than other storms, even after you account for how strong they were when they finally came ashore. Read that again, because it's the part with teeth. Two storms hit the same coast at the same intensity. The one that got there by exploding overnight does more damage than the one that got there slowly. Why? Because of everything that didn't happen in the hours before, the evacuation that started too late, the plywood that never went up, the family that went to bed on Saturday looking at a forecast for a tropical storm. Genevieve is not threatening a coastline, but it is another entry in a ledger that keeps getting longer, and the people who watch that ledger for a living have noticed. Stand on a beach in Newport or Coronado this week and look south. Somewhere over that horizon, more than 1,000 miles away, is a machine the size of a small state, turning at highway speed, sitting on top of water warm enough to swim in. You can't see it. You won't feel a breath of its wind, and by Thursday, you will be standing in something it made, which brings us to a question that Californians have been asking for well over a century, usually with a certain amount of smugness. Why doesn't this state get hurricanes? Because it really doesn't. Since 1854, roughly 85 tropical cyclones have affected California in some form. Almost all of them arrived as leftovers, wet and disorganized, delivering rain and nothing else. In all of recorded history, exactly one hurricane is known to have brought hurricane conditions to the state, and it happened on the 2nd of October, 1858, near San Diego. Modern reconstructions from newspaper accounts and old weather records put it at Category 1. It unroofed houses, uprooted trees, and drove ships onto the shore. And here's the detail that ties it to everything we've just discussed. It happened during an El Nino. The only tropical system known to have actually made landfall in California came in 1939, hitting the Los Angeles area as a tropical storm. 45 people died in the state. That one also came during a period of unusually warm water. The reason for the near-total absence is a river of cold water called the California Current. It flows south along the west coast, carrying chilled water down from the north, and it holds sea surface temperatures along most of the California coastline, somewhere in the 50s and 60s Fahrenheit. A hurricane needs about 80. Push a tropical cyclone north into that water and it doesn't weaken gradually. It collapses. The engine loses its fuel line. The second reason is steering. In the belt between the equator and about 30 degrees north, the prevailing winds blow from east to west. A storm forming off Mexico is generally shoved out into the open Pacific, away from land, which is exactly the path Genevieve is on right now. To get one to California, you'd need the storm moving so fast it survives the cold water on momentum alone, or you'd need the cold water to step aside. In 1858 and in 1939, the water was warmer than usual, and in both cases, the storm was moving unusually fast toward the northeast. So, California's defense is real. It is a wall of cold water and a conveyor belt of wind pointing the wrong way, and it has held for more than 160 years. But that wall stops wind. It does not stop what a hurricane sends across the ocean ahead of itself. Here's the mechanism. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a summer swell the same way again. When 160-mile-an-hour winds blow across open ocean for hours on end, they don't just make choppy water, they organize it. The chaotic slop near the storm sorts itself out as it travels because longer waves move faster than shorter ones. Over hundreds of miles, the mess separates into clean, evenly spaced lines of energy. Forecasters call this a long-period swell, and the period is simply the number of seconds between one crest passing a fixed point and the next. Ordinary summer wind chop in Southern California might have a period of 6 or 8 seconds. Swell from a distant hurricane arrives with periods of 16, 18, sometimes 20 seconds. And here is the part that matters. A longer period doesn't just mean the waves are further apart. It means the wave's energy extends much deeper below the surface, and it means that energy travels much further with much less loss. And critically, the water itself is not traveling. What moves across the ocean is the energy, passing from one parcel of water to the next, each one circling in place and handing the pulse along. The water that breaks on the sand at Huntington Beach on Thursday was never anywhere near Genevieve. Only the message was, that energy moves at roughly 1.5 times the wave period in knots. So a 20-second swell travels across open ocean at something like 35 miles an hour. Which means the swell that leaves the storm today arrives on the California coast about a day and a half later, having crossed more than 1,000 miles of ocean and lost surprisingly little on the way. But it has to be able to get there, and this is where geography turns cruel and specific. Southern California sits behind a shield of land and islands. Baja California blocks a huge arc of the southern horizon. The Channel Islands sit offshore and block more. There is a narrow corridor of open water, called the swell window, through which energy from the south and southeast can actually reach the mainland beaches, and it only opens at certain angles. A storm sitting slightly to the wrong side of that corridor sends its entire energy output into the back of the Baja Peninsula, and the coast feels nothing. Genevieve, as it drifted northwest over the weekend, moved into that window. Now let me tell you what happened the last time a storm like this lined up on that same corridor, because this is the part I've been holding back. In August of 2014, a hurricane called Marie reached Category 5 in the eastern Pacific with winds of 160 miles an hour. Same peak intensity as Genevieve, similar track. It never made landfall in any country, not in Mexico, not in the United States. It stayed out over open water for its entire life, weakened and dissipated at sea. And on the 27th of August, 2014, in the harbor at Long Beach, California, waves generated by that storm broke through the breakwater, not over it, through it. The barrier that protects the port of Long Beach, one of the busiest ports in the Western Hemisphere, was breached in multiple locations. United States damages from Marie came to close to $20 million. Nearly $16 million of that occurred in and around the port of Long Beach. Catalina Island took at least $3 million more. Waves of 10 to 15 feet damaged boatyards and shut down the Malibu Pier after several of its pilings were destroyed. In Seal Beach, water came over the sand at around 11 o'clock at night and went into people's houses. Orange County fire crews built a 6-foot emergency sand berm running 20 blocks from the pier down to 14th Street. A berm like that is a winter project. It normally takes weeks. They built it in 12 hours, overnight, with 2 bulldozers, about 50 firefighters, and 1,000 sandbags. In one day, across Los Angeles and Orange counties, lifeguards pulled nearly 200 people out of the water. The lifeguard chief at Seal Beach, Joe Bailey, said it was the biggest swell he had seen in 25 years. He described the problem plainly. When the surf gets that large, the danger isn't only getting to a drowning person, it's getting back in with them. His crews were having to carry rescued swimmers to specific stretches of beach where the waves were smaller because there was no safe way through anywhere else. At Malibu, a surfer in his 50s was pulled from the water and did not survive. That is the full account of what a hurricane can do to the California coastline without ever coming within 1,000 miles of it. No wind, no rain, no warning sirens. Just water arriving on schedule, carrying energy that was loaded into it 2 days earlier and 1,100 miles away by a storm most people in Long Beach never thought about. So, what about Thursday? Here's where I have to be straight with you, because this is exactly the point where a lot of coverage gets loose. Genevieve is not Marie. The forecasters at Surfline, who model these swells for a living, compared the two directly and were blunt about it. Marie was of similar strength and took a similar track, but it was roughly twice as big in terms of the size of its wind field. And in swell generation, size is not a detail, it's the whole equation. A storm's ability to build a swell depends on how hard the wind blows, how long it blows, and across how much open water it blows. Genevieve is intense but comparatively compact. It can't make what Marie made. Here's what the National Weather Service is actually forecasting. A swell in the range of 5 to 7 feet, producing breaking waves of about 9 to 11 feet at south and southwest facing beaches on Thursday, the 30th of July. Surf building from Wednesday and running through the weekend. At the better exposed spots, waves running 2 to 3 feet overhead. The National Hurricane Center's language is life-threatening surf and rip current conditions, and beach advisories are already up. There's a second factor stacking on top of it, and it's the one I'd pay attention to if you live near the water. Because of the El Nino conditions, tides along the Southern California coast have already been running as much as 6 inches above the predicted levels. 6 inches sounds like nothing. On a beach with a shallow slope, 6 inches of extra water height moves the waterline many feet inland, and it means every wave starts from a higher launch point. Combine that with the lunar high tides this week, and forecasters expect at least minor tidal overflow during the evening high tides, with the possibility of something more notable when Genevieve's swell actually arrives. And now the honesty block, because I'd rather you hear this from me than from a thumbnail. There is no hurricane heading for California. There is no scenario in the current forecast where Genevieve reaches the coast as a storm. It is moving northwest, away from land, and by early Thursday it's expected to cross north of 20 degrees latitude into water cooler than 26 degrees Celsius, which is below the threshold it needs to survive. From there, the weakening accelerates. Forecasters expect it to become post-tropical within about 5 days. No wind is coming, no tropical rain is coming. The state's cold water wall is doing exactly what it has done since 1858. What is coming is water. High, powerful, long-period water arriving on south-facing beaches at the same time as elevated tides at the height of summer when the beaches are full of people who have no reason to expect it. That's the real hazard here, and it's the one that actually hurts people. Not a wall of wind, a rip current on a Thursday afternoon at a beach that looked fine an hour ago. If you have grandchildren visiting the coast this week, that's the conversation. Swim near a lifeguard tower. Assume the water is stronger than it looks. And if you're standing on a pier or a jetty taking pictures, understand that long-period swell arrives and sets, and the biggest set of the day can be twice the size of what you've been watching for 20 minutes. That's how people get taken off rocks. There's one more piece of this, and it's the piece that stretches past this week. Genevieve is the first Category 5 hurricane in the Eastern Pacific since Christie in 2024. It's the first Category 5 to form in that basin during the month of July since 2002. And it's the first major hurricane of 2026 anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, across both the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. That last fact tells you where the heat is sitting this year. The Atlantic has been quiet. The Eastern Pacific has produced 3 storms in quick succession: Elida, then Fausto, then Genevieve, and forecasters expect above average numbers of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes in that basin this season because of El Nino. That's the pattern El Nino usually produces. It tends to suppress Atlantic activity through increased wind shear, and it tends to light up the Eastern Pacific. The forecast is for this event to keep strengthening. 23 of 26 models surveyed in the middle of July projected a very strong El Nino peaking in the October through December window, and the odds of it persisting into early spring of 2027 were put at 97%. For California, that has a specific meaning that goes well past a swell advisory. Strong El Nino winters have historically shifted the storm track south, aiming Pacific systems at the southern half of the state. What sits on the coast right now, the elevated tides, the eroded sand, the beaches that lose material to every big summer swell, is the starting condition that winter will build on. Every foot of sand that Thursday's waves pull off Seal Beach or Newport is a foot of sand that isn't there in January. That is the actual reachback here, not a hurricane, an accounting problem. A coast that spends the summer being slowly pulled apart by storms it can't see, then faces a winter aimed at it by the same ocean that made them. So here's the calendar. Wednesday, the 29th of July, the swell begins building along Southern California, arriving from the south-southeast before clocking around toward the south and southwest. Thursday, the 30th of July, the forecast peak, 9 to 11 foot breaking waves on south and southwest facing beaches, evening high tides with the potential for tidal overflow. This is the day. Through the weekend, the swell holds and slowly fades as Genevieve, by then far to the northwest and sitting over cold water, comes apart. That storm has already done everything it's going to do. The winds that built Thursday's waves were blowing on Monday morning. The energy is already in the water, already moving north at about 35 miles an hour, already unstoppable and already scheduled. Nothing anyone does now changes what lands on that sand. We'll be tracking what actually shows up and what the tide gauges record. Subscribe if you want the measurements rather than the noise. There's another storm behind this one, there always is, in an El Nino year, and we'll be here for that too.